So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Simon, and I'll just give you a quick summary of Simon's work. After completing his PhD at University College London, Simon spent 10 years at the British Museum, first as an archaeological illustrator and then as a museum educator. Following this, he held a Leverhulme Special Research Fellowship at Durham and then joined the University of Leicester in 2000. Simon became a professor at Leicester in 2012, and since then he's also been president of the Ermine Street Guard. Simon's main research interests are Rome and its neighbours society, in particular ancient conflict and visual representation in archaeology. He directs the collaborative International Ancient Ecotery project in Cyprus, and his long-standing research interest in Dura-Europos also continues. So can we please all give Simon a warm welcome?
Thank you very much. Where is the...
Hugo's just going to start sharing the presentation for you now.
Excellent, thank you. Brilliant, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you to Abigail and the team for sorting me out and getting all this set up. Much appreciated. This presentation is about a question of archaeological origins, which I've been meaning to investigate, actually for longer than I'm going to admit. Well, you'll guess how long in a minute. And it's something which the restrictions of the pandemic, combined with the urgent perceived need to decolonise our disciplines, prompted me to get on with over the last 18 months. So contextualising the particular archaeological story we're going to look at led to this becoming actually an interdisciplinary study, as initial exploration of the ancient archaeology, which of course is what I've primarily been working on, proved to be entwined with recent political and military history and modern conflict archaeology in ways which I certainly did not really anticipate. Some of these ways are really very dark. So given my title, I better first explain what Dura-Europos was and what's encompassed by the term Dura-Europos studies, which might be termed a minor academic industry. As some of you will already be aware, a major strand of my own research over the last, I'll fess up, 40 years has been the study of the archaeology of the Hellenistic, Parthian and Roman period city called Dura or Europos. It had twin parallel Aramaic and Greek names, and the hyphenated composite is modern, and it overlooks the west bank of the Euphrates in what's now eastern Syria, close to the Iraqi border. In this area, the swift-flowing Euphrates, as you see here, rather reduced these days by comparison with the past, since the dams have all been constructed, meanders down a very broad valley, which is cut about 40 metres deep into the surrounding limestone and gypsum plateau, which is an otherwise arid steppe environment, baking in summer, sometimes freezing in winter, briefly green in springtime if the meagre winter rains do actually turn up, which they don't every year. Now, the ancient city stood atop cliffs directly above the river, dominating the broad fertile floodplain, which in the latter part of the first millennium BC to the 3rd century AD, as today, was densely settled with villages maintaining irrigation systems and raising plentiful crops and herds. The city was itself a product of ancient imperialisms and literal colonisation. It was established initially as a Macedonian colony sometime around 300 BC, apparently by Seleucus Nicator, who carved the vast Seleucid Empire out of the fragments of Alexander the Great's conquests of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The military colony here was established not least because it was midway between the two poles of Seleucid royal power. So the great new royal city of Seleucia on the Tigris and the cluster of new colony cities in northern Syria, of which Antioch on the Orontes became dominant. In the second half of the 2nd century BC, the initially modest early Seleucid military post and village at Dura was massively expanded with a 3-kilometre long wall circuit and a huge internal citadel in Hellenistic style. It was clearly intended to develop the site into a Hellenizing polis. Within the walls, a Hippodamian street grid was laid out at this period. But in the 110s BC, the embryonic city fell under Parthian rule and would remain so for the following 2.5 centuries. Now, while it retained Greek institutions, laws, and official language, the developing town, which is fairly modest at sort of 50 to 60 hectares, not very big, about the same size as Pompeii, was actually culturally complex with a largely Aramaic-speaking population. And it was taken twice by the Romans in the 2nd century, this is where my own original interest came in. First briefly under Trajan, seemingly as a result of a battle outside the walls, hitherto unknown to history, but commemorated by a triumphal arch on the field. And then it was taken permanently by the Romans from around 165, following which a Roman garrison was installed. And this took over the northern area of the city, which has been the focus of my own work, well, starting in 2005 until I published it 3 years ago. Its purpose of the garrison was largely to act as a forward operating base for Roman aggressions into Parthian-ruled Babylonia, which is roughly modern southern Iraq. During the 90 years or so of the Roman domination of this city, it became even more culturally complex, now also with Jewish and Christian communities. Here's the famous painted synagogue. But the early 3rd century saw collapse of the Parthian Empire and its replacement by the powerful new Sasanian state. And around the year 256, the Sasanians under Shapur I, the Great, besieged the city and destroyed it. This was a much bloodied, ancient conflict landscape. And Dura-Europos was never substantially reoccupied, and its very names were locally forgotten. By the 19th century, the site with its massive upstanding walls was known as SAAH, from a popular association with Saladin. The Dura-Europos was for several centuries then a Euphrates city, but its origins, history, and its fate, and even its afterlife were intimately bound up with imperial conquests, soldiers, great generals, and martial violence, from Seleucus Nicator to Trajan to Shapur the Great. Also the Emperor Julian passed by here after its ruination as well. So this place was born of war and destroyed by war. But how actually do we know all this? Because there's barely a handful of references to this place surviving in ancient texts. It's actually a story told almost entirely through excavation of the site itself and the remarkable discoveries, archaeological and textual, which were made there. Dura was identified in 1920 to 22 in circumstances we're going to look at in a bit more detail, and became the focus of major excavation campaigns by the great Belgian scholar of ancient religion, Frans Cumont, in 1922 and 3, using French soldiers as diggers. And then a much larger Yale French Academy joint expedition from 1928 to 37, masterminded by the famous Russian emigre historian Mikhail Rostovtsev, you see here. The spectacular finds included the painted synagogue we saw just now, one of the earliest Christian places of worship ever found, and many so-called polytheistic temples, including a Mithraeum to gladden Cumont's heart. Here you see Cumont and Rostovtsev in the Mithraeum in the 1930s. As well as a lot of Egyptian-style desiccated finds of all kinds of everyday objects, not least parchments and papyri, which give us a lot of the historical detail. And all these finds led Rostovtsev to proclaim Dura as the Pompeii of the Syrian desert in a book in 1938. So these archaeological treasures meant that Dura gives us our richest snapshot of life in pre-Islamic Southwest Asia. Hence the intensity of study of the site, which features in any synthesis of the region. But World War II scattered the Yale project team, and the great excavations were only ever partially published. Still take up that much shelf space, but that's only a partial publication. So much of my own research has been on the Yale archive since the 1980s, combined with, since 2005, fresh field work under the auspices of the recent renewed Franco-Syrian mission, which further explored the site on a more modest but much more sustained basis from 1987 until another war intervened in 2011, the Syrian civil war. But for this continuing conflict, Dura would surely have been designated a World Heritage Site. It was already on a tentative list. Instead, tragically, like so many other sites in Syria, it was looted on an industrial scale, as you can see in these images. While the people of the nearby villages have suffered terribly, the people who actually helped excavate the site in modern times, many of them now becoming exiles. That's where things now stand at SAAH. It's a grim story in recent years. But what I want to do is to focus on the beginning of the archaeological story of Dura, the events of 1920, which included the first accidentally excavated archaeological find at SAAH, this painting, which would then cascade into the remarkable discoveries of the following 2 decades. Now, here archaeology was entwined with modern military and political history. The story was bound up with a critical moment in the birth of modern Syria and Iraq in ways which I found quite startling when I investigated this. So what follows is about neglected parts of the history of this place. Elements of what we might now frame as its site biography, or given their grim nature, actually its necrography. This is a term coined by Dan Hicks, itself prompted by Achille Mbembe's concept of necropolitics, the politics of who lives and who dies, particularly in colonial contexts. So I was myself actually viscerally shocked by what I discovered during this research, because it involved large-scale and extreme violence, even more than the ancient examples and the modern civil war we've been looking at. So I thought these days a warning might be in order. So identification in the 1920s of ruined SAAH as ancient Dura-Europos was an outcome actually of the carve-up of the Middle East by the British and the French following Ottoman collapse in 1918. The first excavated discovery was accidentally made in March 1920 when British Indian troops, sepoys digging trenches, revealed an ancient painting. The University of Chicago archaeologist James Henry Breasted, who was leading an archaeological reconnaissance of British-occupied Iraq at the time, was asked by the British authorities to investigate the find, which is now known as the Conon painting. It shows a priest labelled as Conon making sacrifice, probably to the god Bel, surrounded by his family. Now, during Breasted's single day's fieldwork at SAAH, the sepoys revealed another mural, the Sacrifice of Julius Terentius, as it's now known, showing Roman soldiers at worship and attesting the name Dura. So this day, the 4th of May, Star Wars Day, 1920, might be seen as the symbolic birthday of Dura-Europos studies, might be, but 1922, rather than 1920, exactly a century ago, argue it has a better claim, because although Breasted recorded the Terentius painting's Dura tag in 1920, he was thereafter far too busy getting his new Chicago Oriental Institute operational to study his field records properly, until his friend Franz Cumont pestered him to do so. And as an Egyptologist, Dura meant absolutely nothing to Breasted. He'd never heard of the place, as indeed had many other people. Though on the 16th of May 1922, he wrote to Cumont tentatively suggesting that maybe this was the ancient name of SAAH he found on this painting, which in his reply on the 5th of June, Cumont then linked with the reference to Dura, called Europos by the Greeks in the Parthian stations of Isidore of Charax. And then Cumont himself confirmed that second toponym, Europos, at SAAH and a newly excavated papyrus when he was there in the following November. And incidentally, then in the letter he wrote telling Breasted about this, coined this term, hyphenated term, Dura-Europos, this new compound. That's when it was actually invented. So he was thinking about this exactly 100 years ago. Years, damn it. Anyway, Breasted's accounts of his very brief 1920 fieldwork at Dura record that the British had recently been fighting Arab forces near SAAH here, but they imply uneasy peace during his brief visit to what he kind of represents as an insignificant and transient imperial policing post with a few Indian soldiers. And that's how I'd always understood it, because I'd only ever looked at the accounts. But one of the things I was able to find during lockdown, when we were all trying to find things we could actually get on with, were the regimental war diaries of the British and Indian, particularly the Indian units, who were here at the time. And these had now appeared online, so I was able to do this from home. So these unstudied military records reveal what was, to me anyway, a shockingly different context for Breasted's activities. So the genesis of the transformation of SAAH into a globally important archaeological site occurred amidst prolonged fighting, with SAAH itself at the epicenter. And this saw pitched battles, torching and shelling of villages, aerial bombing of tented camps, with probably hundreds of Arabs, Indians and Britons killed. But one of the things that I'd often wondered is, what were British Indian troops doing at SAAH in 1920 at all, when the subsequent great campaigns of exploration of the site would occur under French rule? Between the two world wars, Syria was a French, effectively colonial possession. What the hell were the Brits doing there in 1920? And this took some time to understand, an awful lot of chasing up of military history. The story actually begins, surprise, with the First World War. The region had been, up to that time, for centuries under Ottoman rule. But Britain controlled Egypt and Gulf oil fields, and therefore initially was starting to protect its interests against the Ottomans, but this kind of developed into expansionist warfare, so trying to knock the Ottomans out of the war. So after 4 years of warfare, eventually this led to Ottoman collapse in October 1918. The British had invaded the Levant and had occupied Baghdad and the Tigris Valley up as far as Mosul. But they now became concerned at an ensuing power vacuum on the Middle Euphrates. One thing that the British feared was that Kemal Ataturk, or possibly even the Bolsheviks, the new fear in the north, would take advantage and threaten the British imperial position by kind of fomenting trouble in between these two British axes of advance. So they temporarily occupied the Euphrates as far as the town of Dura-Europos, which is the regional capital. Now, the vague plan, and God, it was a vague plan, was to hand the area over to Britain's fledgling client regime in Damascus under their Arab revolt ally, the Emir Faisal, who would soon become proclaimed king of the Arab kingdom of Syria. They were going to do this once the border between the planned new Syrian and Iraqi states was settled at the peace conferences which were underway in Europe at this time. However, Faisal's army was dominated by Al-Ahd al-Iraqi, which was a society of Ottoman-trained Iraqi-born officers, including his chief of staff, Yazin al-Hashimi, who secretly determined to drive the British from their homeland. Without Faisal's knowledge, they planned to foment revolt in Iraq. And they intended to start by driving the British from that regional capital of Deir ez-Zor and vicinity, a zone which under Ottoman rule was not Syria, but somewhere apparently most people felt, in regional but not yet nationalist terms, Iraqi. You'll note also it's a long way from Damascus and Baghdad, so they could kind of get on with plotting and shenanigans there. The idea was that once they showed that Arabs could defeat the British on the Middle Euphrates, then these officers hoped to keep them recoiling in chaos, in disarray, down the river, emboldening all of Iraq to rise against the colonial occupiers. So they would succeed in lighting their fuse at Deir ez-Zor, which would then flare brightly at SAAH, Dura, and then also the small town of Abu Kamal, before burning on down the Euphrates to detonate in the Shia holy cities of Karbala and Najaf. But these Iraqi officers would themselves get burned in the process. The first step was achieved in December 1919 when one of Faisal's ex-Ottoman officers, Ramadan al-Shalash, you see his splendid uniform here, himself son of a sheikh of a section of the local Agaidat Bedouin, seized Deir ez-Zor from the British. Shalash's forces then advanced downstream through Salhiya, taking Abu Kamal too. The British responded quickly by driving him out of Abu Kamal, but did not try to retake Deir because London had already decided to hand it to Faisal's Syria. So the result was perceived across the Arab world exactly as the Iraqi officers wanted. The Deir ez-Zor affair, as it became known, was a sensational, unavenged defeat for the British, which Shalash and others used to foment armed resistance among the Agaidat tribal grouping. Their land stretched all the way from Deir ez-Zor down to Abu Kamal, where Shalash and his allies attacked the British garrison, ambushed its supply columns, and the British replied with bombardment and ground attacks. In January 1920, they took the fight to the Agaidat. They established a garrison of sepoys, supported by cavalry, artillery, and armoured cars at Salhiya on the road to Deir. So this clifftop location allowed surveillance and bombardment of the Agaidat heartland on the fertile Euphrates plain. That group in that area were the people who were most strongly resisting the British. So in archaeological terms, this may be seen as also as another phase of development, the grim development of the conflict landscape here, which goes back at least to Roman times. Thus it was that from January to May 1920, Salhiya again became an imperial military base as it had been under Roman rule. Some parallels which, as you can imagine, were of some ironic interest to me. Shalash, aided by other Ottoman-trained Iraqi officers and veteran NCOs, encouraged Agaidat attacks on convoys supplying British headquarters at Abu Kamal and on Salhiya itself. Salhiya garrison was attacked with rifles and grenades, ineffectively, yet the British kept reinforcing it, eventually to 500 sepoys, which is a garrison nearly as big as it was in the Roman period. So supply convoys from Abu Kamal became targets for ambushes. And on the 5th of March, Agaidat fighters killed a British officer and 10 Indian cavalrymen escorting such a convoy. And then days later, the British avenged this by mauling another ambush force in the same area, killing 40 Agaidat in a pitched battle involving ferocious hand-to-hand combat. It really was up close and personal. There were Agaidat trying to grab machine guns off some of the Indian sepoys. It was that close. Fought with lances as well as rifles. So even though they got so badly mauled, including being shelled by the Royal Artillery, the Agaidat refused to submit to British control. They carried on fighting. These guys were very tough. The British then stepped up efforts to negotiate with the Agaidat sheikhs, but also at the same time to intimidate and punish the recalcitrant. Now, both the rather paltry carrots, there weren't very many carrots, and the big sticks were wielded by the regional political officer, Lieutenant Colonel Gerard Leachman. And I'm pretty certain that's him in this photograph of the archaeological visit. Leachman was an experienced Arabist who regarded Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, as a hopeless romantic. He was an excellent horseman and guerrilla leader and a ruthless imperialist. He habitually carried a stick and used it on Arabs, who regarded him with a mixture of fear and respect as a conspicuously brave but violent strongman. A lurid example of both Leachman's reckless courage and his ferocious brutality occurred in mid-April, when he took his armoured car, specifically this vehicle, in search of Arabs responsible for repeatedly disrupting the telegraph line between Abu Kamal and Deir ez-Zor, and apparently somewhere near Salhiya, Dura, caught a party of Bedouin with camels dragging wire and poles out onto the barren plain. So bursts of machine gun fire over their heads halted them, and Leachman leapt out of the vehicle. Its driver, Lance Corporal Wing, who you see here leaning on the wing of the vehicle, recorded what happened in his diary, and this ended up in Leachman's biography in the 1930s. So Wing recorded there were 30 armed Bedouin, and he had nothing but a stick, but he dashed in among them, and he was covered by a machine gun, incidentally, if they tried anything much. Hell was let loose. We stood spellbound in the car while he fought 30 Bedouin single-handed. Every Arab, with the exception of 5 who ran away, were down and out or on their knees yelling for mercy, but he showed none. When at last he'd finished, he picked 2 of them up, dragged them back to the car. And what a mess all 3 of them were in. Colonel Leachman was saturated with blood. He picked them up and threw them bodily into the car. Next morning, Leachman tried the prisoners Abu Kamal and imposed a large fine, paid in gold, sheep, goats, jewellery and fodder, every member of the tribe contributing, his biographer records. During these weeks, Leachman exhorted and cajoled the rest of the Agaidat sheikhs to come to terms, while the army at Salhiya and around encouraged the recalcitrant with gunfire. Artillery on Salhiya's cliff tops shelled settlements across the valley. Brigade-strength punitive ground operations involving over 1,000 troops were also conducted from the walls of the ancient city. And it was during one of these that sepoys digging further entrenchments, because despite all the firepower, the garrison still felt vulnerable to Arab attack, they accidentally revealed the Conan painting, beginning the archaeological story. One of the things I still find staggering is that in the middle of all of this, British officers, including Leachman, and even the commander, Brigadier Frank Conyngham, who incidentally, a family member, Robin Conyngham, is currently in Durham Department. Anyway, Frank Conyngham took the trouble to sketch and photograph the painting and to report the discovery to British HQ in Baghdad. Because these are educated, classically educated gentlemen, they found art, they reported up the chain of command. This was even as, that same day, these cultured English gentlemen were directing sepoys to burn surrounding Agaidat villages and were sending aircraft to machine gun and bomb more distant encampments. The report of the discoveries was seen and rated important by Gertrude Bell, who advised the government on archaeological matters in Baghdad. And this led to Brester's invitation to come and properly record it. As the fighting continued through April, Leachman summoned a large irregular cavalry force from his particular Bedouin allies of the far steppe, the Aniza, and led them to surprise, defeat, disarm, and find some of the main hostile Agaidat groups in a dawn raid. Yet others were still resisting, so the bombardments continued after all these many weeks. With springtime advancing, all the Agaidat sections around Salhiya were gradually shelled, bombed and machine gunned and threatened into submission. Now, unbeknownst to most of the combatants on both sides, on the 25th of April 1920, the San Remo Conference finally settled the border between Faisal's Syria and British-controlled Iraq, running south of Abu Kamal. So Salhiya was now going to be inside Syria. As April drew to a close, the British prepared to withdraw from both Salhiya and Abu Kamal and to hand the area to Faisal's officials. Leachman hoped they had successfully pacified the Agaidat so that this could be plausibly represented as an orderly, voluntary handover of territory between allies. However, Maulud Mukhlis, Faisal's governor in Deir ez-Zor, was another Iraqi-born officer prominent in the clandestine plan to humiliate the British and trigger revolt downriver. The Iraqi officers now found themselves facing a dilemma. The withdrawal agreement defined the new Syrian-Iraqi border where they did not want it. They wanted Deir ez-Zor, Salhiya and Abu Kamal to be Iraqi, as it seemed to most of the local population, not that there was actually a plebiscite or anything on this. As the British were preparing to withdraw, Brester's team arrived to inspect the archaeological finds at SAAH, and on 4th of May, as we saw, Dura's name was revealed and recorded, if not yet understood. They, as the Chicago party crossed into Faisal, Syria, en route to Beirut and home, Leachman overtook them in his armour car on his way to sign the new border agreement. And Mukhlis feigned illness to avoid having to sign off on the new border, while his subordinates demanded a codicil should be added to the agreement, noting they regarded this frontier line as temporary. But they signed it just to get the British retreating again. And they ensured that that was then under fire. Now, what SAAH itself was evacuated quietly enough. The British were subsequently harassed by Al-Qaeda attacks all the way back into Iraq and beyond the border. The events in and around SAAH have been closely watched by the Arab press. This was a big story at the time. And the withdrawal of the British was indeed seen in Iraq as another British defeat, like at Deir ez-Zor, working exactly as Mukhlis and Shalash had hoped. The Al-Qaeda actually had a very poor reputation among other Arab groups as fighters. They were regarded as sort of peasant farmers as opposed to noble Bedouin of the more of the desert. And this was actually an Arab sort of ranking system between different groups. This is not a colonial imposition. So the idea was that if even they could beat the British, then so could everybody else. Maulud and Shalash kept quiet the fact that the Al-Qaeda had actually been led by Ottoman-trained veteran soldiers who were very important. In fact, actually, as far as I could work out from the war diaries, the British never twigged that. They thought they were just fighting recalcitrant Bedouin who were troublemakers. So this insurgency, now rumbling down the Euphrates, built up until it exploded into full-scale revolt in Iraq in July, which profoundly shook British control of the country. And in the course of this, Leachman was murdered. Ultimately, the British did manage to put down the revolt, but nonetheless, it's passed into Iraqi national consciousness as a foundational moment, the revolution of 1920, which is the equivalent of 1776 for Americans. However, even as the Iraqi officers' strategy seemed to be working in the summer of 1920, and the San Remo border looked set to be swept away by a greater Iraq born through armed revolution, they found themselves blindsided by the French. As the Iraqi revolt reached its climax in July, French forces invaded Syria from the west, suppressed Faisal's regime and established rule within the agreed borders, nominally as a mandate from the League of Nations, but de facto as a French imperial colony. SAAH would now be permanently part of Syria after all. Shalash would spend the remainder of his life intermittently fighting the French in prison or in exile. I think he did live long enough to see Syria achieve independence. Mukhlis ended up as an Iraqi minister. British made Faisal king of Iraq as consolation prize for losing Damascus. Now, the events on the Middle Euphrates in 1919-20, with SAAH becoming the epicenter, could well be seen today as a tale of heroic Arab nationalist resistance to brutal Western colonialisms, involving a Pyrrhic victory over the British, followed by tragic defeat by the French before final liberation in World War II. And of course, there is a lot of truth in that kind of narrative. But open and critical scholarship mustn't shy away from the whole truth, however uncomfortable for narratives which may currently seem attractive. And archival research by historians of the more recent period, conducted in recent decades, has revealed further deeply disturbing layers to the necrography of early 20th century SAAH surrounding the archaeology. So until 1918, as the Middle Euphrates was part of the Ottoman Empire, people generally shared an Ottoman mindset in terms of religious and political identity, while the leading Arab protagonists, the events of 1919 to 20, have been educated and trained in Ottoman military academies. But before 1914, increasing Turkish ethno-nationalism started making Arabs reflect on their future within the empire. and on their own potential national identity, or identities maybe Assyrians or Iraqis. All of this was extremely fluid at the time. In 1915, as the Ottomans fought Orthodox Russia, Turkish ethno-nationalists expelled Christian Armenian populations from Anatolia, from what today would be Eastern Turkey, ostensibly for resettlement, but in practice for genocide. Hundreds of thousands were driven down the Tigris and Euphrates valleys on death marches or to face direct massacre. Males were slaughtered first, while females were subjected to systematic rape or abduction as sex slaves, or forcible conversion and integration into local populations. The greatest epicenter of the slaughter of 1915-16 was Deir ez-Zor, which became the Auschwitz of the Armenian people. And the genocide almost certainly directly touched SAAH, apart from the thousands of bodies floating down the Euphrates, many of which ended up in Iraq. 20,000 Armenians are known to have been murdered near Anna, which is today in Iraq. They must have been driven along the road from Deir to Abu Kamal on the way to their deaths. So those straggling columns of despairing, starving, brutalised women and children, most adult males already being dead by this stage, would have hobbled through the ruins of SAAH. Perhaps some died there by the roadside. Now, many Dairis remembered the slaughter in the region with horror, subsequently facilitated Armenian genocide research and memorialisation. So this was the 20th century's archetypal genocide until eclipsed by the Nazi Holocaust, was masterminded by Turkish ideologues, but largely perpetrated by Chechens. And where Chechens were unavailable, others were co-opted to do the killing and were allowed to take their pick of victims for enslavement and forcible conversion. In the Deir region, Turkish records attest that the perpetrators of the genocide included the Agaidat. Suggests to me one final horrific twist to the violence surrounding the genesis of Dura studies in 1920. As British imperial forces found and recorded ancient paintings at SAAH, while raining the villages and camps of the surrounding Agaidat with mechanised death, those communities may well have incorporated abducted Armenian women, British shells and machine gun bullets adding a new layer of terror to their traumatic existence. So, as Jen Baird, formerly of this school, has emphasised, archaeology at Dura was, from the very outset with Breasted in 1920, not disinterested scholarship, was already arguably morally compromised by intimate entanglement with Western colonial domination of the region, and in particular by direct dependence on foreign colonial military power to be conducted at all. This also characterised Couman's work in 1922 to 1923, conducted by, as you see here, Foreign Legion troops and French colonial troops, some of them Syrian, some from North Africa. And it's only slightly less blatantly true, I guess, of the Yale expedition, which was staffed by local Bedouin, by the Agaidat, but again relied very heavily on French logistical support, fuel and things, on French aerial photography, and so on, and indeed for security, not least. And there was further colonial violence, which I won't trouble you with, even during this expedition. So this reality has to be fully acknowledged. But as I've outlined, there is more to the dark tale of violence around early 20th century SAAH than simply the brutality of Western colonialisms. So modern scholarship has, of course, primarily Western roots, but is today increasingly globalised and critical. And it's still got a long way to go. Historical and archaeological study of the Middle East does not yet have as many Arab and other voices as it should. I think we'd all admit that, although that is changing. While the regime in Turkey is still actively denying things like the Armenian genocide. Still, research already undertaken clearly reveals a recent history of Dura-Europos SAAH and its region, in which few actors actually have clean hands. Fully affirming our common humanity also involves frankly confronting our seemingly equally shared capacity for inhumanity in ancient times or modern, under whatever ideological banner, whether colonialist, ethnic, religious, nationalist, neo-imperialist, or anything else. Slava Ukraini. So in closing, all this raises an important question for discussion, I think. Once we've duly exposed the historical entanglements of our discipline in the violence of colonialism, what actually do we do next, especially with the scholarship, the received scholarship of the era? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was absolutely fascinating. We're just going to stop sharing the screen now, and we can just look to see if there are any questions in the room or any questions from the guests online that they might like to either unmute themselves to ask, or if they'd like to pop them in the chat box, we can read from there. Hi.
Thanks, Simon. That's really interesting. It's always interesting, isn't it, kind of situating archaeological scholarship in its political context, especially the scholarship of the 20th century and 19th centuries. But that also applies to us to a degree as well, doesn't it? How do you think, for example, your work, or the kind of intellectual context in which you've worked since over the course of the last 40 years, as you said, will be viewed in 50 or 60 or 70 years as a product of its time?
Absolutely. I'm sure I'd likely to come in for some stick as well. And I kind of been doing it long enough now to feel very uncomfortable about the earlier phases of what I was doing. Actually,